waited out and waited out and waited out, and then captured the city, burnt it down, and destroyed the city completely. Now, a very important addition to this is in the early 20th century, in a French excavation in northern Syria, an inscription called the Zakur inscription was found, in which in the 10th line it says that Bir-Hadad, the son of Hazael, came to capture the city in which Zakur was in, and when he came, the forces of Bir-Hadad raised a wall higher than the wall of Hazrael and dug a ditch deeper than its ditch. So perhaps what we have here is a literary mention of the same method of siege that we see on the ground at Gat. Now, the site of Hadrach is identified as a site called Tel Afis in northern Syria, and I've been hoping for years that there would finally be a peace treaty between Israel and Syria. I could visit it and check it out for myself, and it looks like that's not going to happen. So I'll have to wait. Maybe the next generation will check it out, and perhaps we can find the on-the-ground evidence of this also in another site. Now, without going too much into the details, we date this campaign to around 830, both on historical reasons, but also based on carbon-14 dating, and fits in very well with the general picture. And once this occurs, Philistia changes, and Gat ceases to be the major city, and the 4 other cities become more important, and simultaneously the kingdom of Judah starts expanding westwards, and things are very different from this point onwards. And in fact, from this point onwards, Gat is not a major player anymore. Gat does not figure in as a major Philistine city anymore. Now, what we do have after this, there was a very interesting thing. When we excavated in several places on the site, we found that destruction layer, which I mentioned. And in this case, we found lots of brick collapses, bricks that had fallen off walls, and right below it, a thin layer of wind-blown sediment. That means that in between this destruction layer and this brick collapse, there had been a period in which the wind had brought in dust. And just shows you that you have to clean your house from dust, because if not, it eventually gets very deep. And then right above this, we had late 8th century levels. So what we may have here is a human-caused event, the Aramean destruction, abandonment, this brick collapse, which we would like to suggest as an earthquake, and I'll talk about it in detail above it, and it's sandwiched in between 2 late 8th century levels. So if this is late 9th and this is late 8th, this has to be somewhere in between. And it just happens that there is let me show you what I'm talking about. Here you have the foundation of this wall, and we can see that there are 2 forces working here. One is, first, the wall shifts off the foundation, and then a second force collapses the bricks. Now, this is very well known in seismology, that when an earthquake hits, there are 2 major energy forces. One is horizontal, and it hits first, and a second, which is called the S wave, which is, if you want, a wavy wave, hits a couple of seconds later. And very often what you'll have is the buildings will move, and then the second wave will cause them to collapse. And this is what we apparently have here. Now, the problem is, though, when you have stone architecture which collapses, there are very, very clearly defining aspects that seismologists can identify which tell you it's an earthquake. Once you're dealing with bricks, it's a little more difficult, but since we have long walls in which this occurred, it seems that this is a clear case of earthquake collapse. And this is important because this can be connected to a biblical tradition of a major earthquake that occurred in the mid-8th century, about 760. It's mentioned in the book of Amos, in which, in the first verse of the book, they introduce who this guy Amos is, and it tells us that his prophecy started 2 years before the earthquake. And in the book of Zechariah, which is hundreds of years after this event, there is still a very distinct memory of that this is sort of like the earthquake when the big fire of Chicago? 1900 something. So this is the, what?
1871.
What?
1871.
Yeah, okay, there you go. I'm good in ancient history, not in modern history. 1871. So, and everybody remembers the big fire of Chicago. So here, for centuries afterwards, they remember this enormous event. And it's not only in Jerusalem. This event apparently was so significant that the seismic forces knocked down buildings all the way in Philistia, which is much farther from the epicenter, which would be somewhere in the Jordan Valley. So we have a very serious event here. Now, after this, and here we're finishing up soon, after the Hazael conquest and this earthquake, we see a very clear change in the site. And for a brief period, we start seeing material culture which is not Philistine anymore, but Judite. And we can see houses and pottery and figurines and other objects which fit in perfectly with what we would find in Jerusalem at the time, at Lachish at the time, at Judite sites. And what this indicates is that for a brief period of time, this site was taken over by the Judite kingdom, and this fits in perfectly what we know from the Assyrian texts and from the biblical texts, is that Hezekiah, king of Judah, tried to expand westward for a brief period in the late 8th century, and then in a series of 2 campaigns, first by Sargon II, and second by his son Sennacherib, particularly in 701, Hezekiah is pushed back into the core region around Jerusalem, and the site of Gat is destroyed. And in fact, with that, we sort of end the story of the Philistines, except, of course, we have to mention another site. I promised we'd mention another site, so I chose to mention Ashkelon. And of course, Larry Sager, which some of you may remember, once was at the Oriental Institute here, excavator of Ashkelon. And we know that while Gat was destroyed in 830, the other Philistine cities continued to exist. And until 604, when Nebuchadnezzar, the same Nebuchadnezzar that destroys Jerusalem about 20 years later, campaigns to Philistia, destroys the remaining Philistine cities, razes them to the ground, takes all the Philistines and ships them off to Mesopotamia and deports them. And with that, basically, is the end of the Philistine culture. So you have this period from just after 1200 till just before 600, close to 600 years of a vibrant culture which appears, transforms, develops, and then ends quite suddenly. So let's get back to the original question. So who are the Philistines? So first of all, everybody agrees it appears somewhere after the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. And what we now can see, though, is we won't ever be able to find that one place where the Philistines came from, but rather, most probably, it's an amalgamation of peoples that came from various areas in the West and came and settled in Canaan. And when they settled in Canaan, they settled with the Canaanites. We don't see evidence of a destruction of the Canaanite cities, except here and there small parts of cities, but rather, apparently they settled down, and maybe the Philistines became the elites, but they settled with the Canaanites together. And the Philistine culture in itself is a hybrid, entangled culture. It's not, there wasn't somewhere where they acted like Philistines out there in the West, and they just moved it over. But rather, the Philistine culture as we know it is a combination of all these aspects, local and foreign, together. We can see slow change and a lot of culture, but they retain a cultural identity. And while they were adversaries of the Israelites and the Judites, there was a lot of other things going on. And as we see archaeologically, the Samson story itself is a great example of this. Because Samson, you always think of Samson, he killed the Philistines, he was killed by the Philistines, but he also married a couple of Philistines, visited a Philistine prostitute in Gaza, there were a lot of things going on. There's a very mixed, and again, it doesn't matter whether the story actually occurred or not, but it tells us, someone once defined the Samson story as border fiction. That means it's telling the story of the interactions that went on in the border between the Israelites and the Philistine zones. And that's what we can see archaeologically as well. And the biblical descriptions of the Philistine-Israelite relations, even though we know so much about it, and it seems that there's so much information, but when we start looking at the details, there's a lot that's not there. And a very good example of this is the fact that, according to the biblical text, the Philistines from the 10th century were subservient to the Israelites, and that seems very much not the case. And finally, the Philistines disappear after 604, and it's a complete and total disappearance. And in fact, after 604, you cannot talk of a Philistine culture anymore. And what happened apparently is that the devastation that the Babylonians wrought on Philistia was so complete that there were very few people living in Philistia. And when we see resettlement of Philistia a couple of centuries later, it's with Phoenicians. There are no Philistines there. And the Philistines who were taken to Mesopotamia within 100 years or so assimilated and lost their cultural identity, and there was nobody there who was identified as a Philistine. And of course, everybody always asks me, is there a connection between the Philistines and the Palestinians? Well, the answer, like any good Jewish answer, is yes and no. And the no is, let's start with the no, there is no cultural or genetic connection between the Philistines and the Palestinians. And also, by the way, according to the Palestinian national narrative, they don't want to be Philistines. They want to be Canaanites. But there is a connection, and the connection is quite simple. From the Iron Age, when the Philistines lived in Philistia, the Greeks started reaching this region, and traders, mercenaries, etc. And the region where the Philistines lived was called Philistia. The name of this region was retained, and later on, after the second Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 CE, as a punishment against the Jews who revolted, Hadrian, the Roman emperor, renamed the entire land of Israel from Judea to Palestina. He took the name of the region of southern coastal plain and renamed the entire region. So that's why anybody who lived in the land of Israel, the southern Levant, from the time of Bar Kokhba until 1948 was called a Palestinian, whether you were Jewish, Arab, or Christian. And in fact, I have many friends who tell me that they can show me their grandparents' identity card from the time of the British Mandate, where it says that they're a Palestinian, even though they're Jews. So the connection between the Palestinians and the Philistines is mainly a geographical connection, just like there is nobody of the Manhattan tribe who lives in Manhattan, but we still call it Manhattan. So what's left is for all of you to join me on the excavation, and in July we'll be out there. And if you want more information, and I blog, I like blogging, so if you want to follow what goes on the excavation and things that are going on during the year, you can look that up. And if you don't come, a berserk Philistine warlord will come after you. Thank you very much.